Scriitorul Abdulrazak Gurnah, laureat al Premiului Nobel pentru Literatură în 2021, este unul dintre invitații FILIT de anul acesta. S-a născut pe insula Zanzibar, într-o familie musulmană cu rădăcini în Yemen. În urma retragerii protectoratului britanic a Revoluției din anii 60 și preluarea puterii de către un regim opresiv, Gurnah se hotărăște să părăsească țara. Va studia în Marea Britanie. Abdulrazak Gurnah a predat literatura engleză și postcolonială la Universitatea din Kent. După 35 de ani la catedră, este onorat cu titlul profesor emerit. Din 2006 este membru al Societății Regale de Literatură. De la debutul său din 1987 a publicat 10 romane. Este laureat al unor prestigioase premii literare, iar în 2021 este distins cu Nobel. Scritura sa profundă explorează efectele devastatoare ale colonialismului asupra națiunilor africane, condiția refugiatului și complexa problematică a migrației. Cele mai multe dintre poveștile lui Gurnah au ca fundal coasta de est a Africii și urmăresc destinele tragice ale unor oameni obișnuiți în contextul dislocării, violenței și brutalității istoriei.
Professor Abdulrazak Gurnah, thank you for kindly agreeing to share some insights into your work and maybe life with me.
It's a pleasure.
I will start off with a confession that may not be in my favor. I will admit, regardless, that I first decided to read one of your novels because you were a Nobel Prize awarded author. And as I sank into your literature, because I didn't stop at one novel, I realized that I might have missed on one of my favorite authors, hadn't it been for the Nobel recognition to awake my curiosity.
That's good, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I know you've provided answers to this question several times, but maybe journalists rushed into asking how you felt about Nobel Prize immediately after it was announced. It seems more relevant now that you know your books have reached so many people, such as myself. So here it is, once again. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about the Nobel Prize?
All right, yeah.
And how did it alter you as writer and human being along these 3 years?
The first question then, how do I feel? I felt absolutely delighted. I think for every writer it would be a kind of recognition that would matter. They do it once a year, one writer a year, and there are many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of writers. And so to be pointed at, I know it's only the Swedish Academy, but the impact of the prize is that it is a global prize. Everybody gets to hear about it. So it was absolutely wonderful to be told that. At the time, I didn't think, what will it mean? You know, I didn't immediately think the money or the whatever. People think that, oh, you got all that money. But I didn't think like that. It really was a kind of
you were
like
just
a
happy about
writerly thing.
it.
Yeah, it was a writerly thing that to the kind of recognition. And then on reflection, you can see that it would lead to people wanting to know, who is this fellow? What's his work like? And so on. So there's no problem with the fact that you came across it as a result of that, because that, I think, is precisely what literary prizes do. They tell us about writers we might not have heard about, whether it's a big one like the Nobel or even not so big ones. And so if you're a reader, or if you're interested in reading, you might say, okay, I'll make a list of 3, 4, I'll go and get those. So if nothing else, literary prizes, I mean, there are other things to do with literary prizes, sales, etc., but if nothing else, that literary prizes draw attention to writers who might not have heard of. And if you're a writer and you're one of those lists, it's lovely. You think, yep, okay, now people will perhaps read more of my books.
Do you feel the Nobel Prize fatigue? Traveling worldwide, giving interviews, answering to the same questions?
Well, no, they're always slightly inflected, slightly differently. So there is enough difference to be able to keep awake when you're answering the question. It is fatiguing, but the fatigue is not the events, say like this or like the festival. The fatigue really is to do with traveling. Mm-hmm. And as you know, I'm sure, traveling, you know, there's so much time spent in sort of getting to the airports, hanging around at the airport, going through this, actually the traveling part of it and flights and etc. And if you're doing 2 or 3 of these in, say, in a month, for example, yeah, it can be quite tiring.
Did you learn to write in airports?
No, I learned to write in flights, though, because some of the flights are quite long. And, you know, as soon as you get onto one of those long-distance flights, they feed you and switch the lights off. And that's it. Go to sleep.
That's right.
And if you either are not able to or don't want to, then it's a really quiet 3 or 4 hours. You can just sit there and with a notebook and do something quite useful.
So you left Zanzibar when you were 18 alongside your brother. And I know you prefer not to use the term refugee. However, it is fair to say you fled the country, which was a dangerous place at that time. What was happening in Zanzibar that made you want to leave?
Yeah, first of all, let me say why I don't like to use the word refugee, because partly it's because I think running these words together is something that allows particularly authorities to refuse to act when they should be acting. So refugee, it seems to me, is somebody whose life is in danger, whether it's from bombs or whether through threats or through imprisonment or something like that. And therefore they are leaving in order to escape with their lives or to stay alive. It seems to me that there is an obligation, a human obligation, to offer hospitality to such a person. On the other hand, there are people who leave because they're seeking a better life, which is also a perfectly moral reason to move, as millions of people in human history have done. There, it's a more negotiated thing. So you say, well, actually there isn't room here, so you can't come here, go try somewhere else. So by putting all of these people together, people who are migrating because they have a skill, or people who are migrating because they're seeking a better life, or people who are refugees, by lumping them all together, it means you don't have to do anything about any of them. You can just criminalize the whole lot and say they're all refugees or they're all asylum seekers. We don't want them. So it's important, I think, to separate these things. So I wasn't a refugee, nor was my brother. We left because we wanted to get an education. The conditions were difficult. So even to say we fled is not really the same thing. We left. And we left because we wanted a different kind of life. We wanted to study, acquire skills, fulfill ourselves.
But there was also a lot happening in Zanzibar at
Absolutely.
that time, people being arrested.
Absolutely. It was a difficult time, but my life was not in danger.
This was after the revolution?
Not immediately, some 3 or 4 years after when we left. And the reason we left is because the schools were closed. And so there was no possibility of continuing to study. And there were other things that were not right, but not a danger to life. So that's why I'm hesitating about refugee.
So you found yourself, a young African, in the UK, forced to cope with displacement, with the loneliness and the upright contempt that a stranger might have felt.
Absolutely.
And you channeled these experiences into your novels, Memory of Departure, Desertion, By the Sea. One of your characters, Rashid, in Desertion says, "The earliest lesson I received in London was how to live with disregard." And he goes on, "I started seeing myself through their eyes as a person worthy of contempt. It has taken me a lot of time not to care, years, a lifetime." I will not ask you if Rashid is you, because I already know the answer. But were you shocked, just like Rashid, with the racism?
Yes, I was shocked. I was shocked because I was ignorant. I didn't know. It wasn't something I anticipated. Also, I was young, and so I probably didn't have the kind of resources and strategies. How do you deal with a situation that is hostile? But it was a surprise. And I think a great many things have changed in that 50-year period or so. Then there was a sense in which a lot of people in England were almost unconscious of the hostility.
Of their racism.
Yeah, of how they were expressing themselves. There is, I think, now much greater self-awareness of what you can say, and what is proper to say to somebody's face. Well, never mind what you're thinking. What you're thinking is your business. But there is a way in which, in a civilized society, you learn to be courteous to the other.
At the same time, we've seen and heard of the racist riots in the UK. It made global news.
I know.
It reached Romania as well. How did it feel to see it unfolding?
It doesn't mean that it's gone. I'm not saying that it's gone, but now there are laws against that. The fact that you know about it means that there are people who are appalled by it, who think it shouldn't have happened. And so that's part of the change. It doesn't mean that it's all been wiped away or anything like that. People still express it fully. That's why we had Brexit, for example, because foreigners are foreigners, whether they're black foreigners or Romanian foreigners or whoever. There is a way in which a certain kind of spark can be ignited amongst certain members of society or certain areas where all this can come out again. But I'm thinking that at the time it would have been fairly almost funny to be abusive to somebody who's a stranger, and particularly if they're a dark complexioned stranger. School children would do it, the bus conductor would do it, college students would do it. It's funny. It's not abusive. So that's what I mean, really, that kind of lack of self-awareness, or the lack of awareness of the other person, how they might feel about being treated with contempt in this way. So that was a surprise. And then you learn, or I learn, you learn how do you deal with that sort of situation. There are many ways, but when you're new to it, you don't know how to deal with it. But ways of dealing with it, for example, you learn where not to go. You learn what to avoid. You learn not to make eye contact with people, because if you do, almost always, the result is hostility. It's like dogs, apparently. If you look dogs in the eye, they think you're being hostile, so they get angry at you. So the same kind of thing. You avoid certain situations like that might provoke a response. And then life moves on, and you become more confident.
How did the young African forced to leave Zanzibar become confident, and how did he become a writer in the UK? At what point did you start writing fiction?
Because it wasn't all hostile. The experience wasn't all about hostility, really. The experience was also about adventure, about new things, learning, opening up to the world in a way. A lot of people were kind, very kind in many cases. So it wasn't all like that. But the overriding feeling as you're walking around and not knowing how to cope, not knowing how to operate, not knowing how to go to a bank or not go to a restaurant or how to speak in class or all of it. So it takes a while. It took a while to overcome those things. But in the meantime, people were encouraging and comfortable. And I guess the other thing is that everybody learns to live. Wherever you are, you get on with it, you live.
So one of the ways you learned to cope was writing.
Yeah, sure. But that was a very slow process, in the sense that, as any writer probably knows, it takes a long time from
to be published.
but even to write, when you're starting to kind of, to sort of even to begin to think about, I'm going to write, it's not a matter of, I know it amazes me sometimes when I see young people going to university saying, I'm going to do a creative writing course because I'm going to become a writer. When I made the decision to become a writer, I'm not criticizing them, I'm just saying I'm amazed. But when I thought I might become a writer, it took me years to be able to actually say to somebody, this is what I'm going to do. Because it seemed such a great big thing to aspire to, such an ambition. So it wasn't just I'll become a writer and therefore I'll get over this sense of strangeness. But it helped, no doubt. Sort of reading, I think, probably helped more rather than writing. Reading and understanding and seeing that that you share this experience with other people, not necessarily people like you, but other people in different parts of the world. That this experience of strangeness and having to learn to cope, and or displacement or whatever. Afterlives,
your most recent novel, published in 2020, is about a young man, Hamza, who joins the German army, Schutztruppe, to fight the British on African land. And as we read the book, we find out that it was actually not the Germans fighting the British in World War I on African land. It was the Africans fighting the Africans, because both were colonies, armies. And some episodes are just heartbreaking, the ones about soldiers dying in their thousands, being eaten by crocodiles, their bodies dug up by hyenas, dying in the hundreds of thousands while they struggled on in their murderous embrace of a cause whose origins they did not know, and whose ambitions were vain and ultimately intended for their domination. What inspired you to write about the war as it happened in this part of the world, East Africa?
Because I heard about it when I was a child. So there are people still alive who participated in that, including a member of my family. And people were talking about, the Germans were no longer there then, because they'd lost their empire after the 1918 war at Versailles. They lost their colonies, like every European nation at that time thought it deserved to have colonies in other parts of the world. But we heard about them. So they were absent. It was rather interesting, actually, because the British were there. And you saw the British in an everyday way. Mm-hmm. You know, there they are, they're looking ridiculous in their shorts or whatever it is. Or even they're looking officious or something. But the Germans were absent and were only present as a myth. And in a way, that made that story more potent, because what could be told about them? Oh, they're ferocious. Oh, they're very well organized. Or they're very hard. And so this myth grows. And I think I always wanted to know more about it, even as a child. But there was very little written about it. Later on, when I was a writer, when I was writing and an academic and so on, I still wanted to know more. But in fact, when I wrote Paradise, my intention was partly to write about the war, that war. But I didn't.
Afterlives was considered a sequel to Paradise.
Kind of. It follows on. It's not really a sequel, in that people are not the same, but it's kind of carries on the period some 30 years later. Yeah, the reason for writing about it is because I knew something about it, and I thought, why can't we know more about it? Let me try and find out, and then let me write about it. And it's also because of the curious issues that come out of it. You mentioned one already, which is that the participants in this violence were all Africans, on the whole. There were also Indians, and there were also some officers, as it were, German officers and British officers. But the combatants were largely, the majority of them were Africans. So how did that happen? Who are these people, and why did they decide to join a mercenary army to kill each other? So that also interested me. That kind of the ironic dimension of that interested me. Why did they do it? It couldn't have been just stupidity. There must have been reasons. What would have made people do something like that? And so I tried to engage with that question in writing.
Did you find an answer?
Well, I think there are several answers. I think the first answer is that they didn't think of themselves as Africans. It was the idea of a continental identity hadn't yet happened. So they thought of themselves as different from the people of the other side of the mountain, who were just other people. Perhaps even traditionally they were their enemies even. The other thing is that the colonial authorities did not allow people to fight in the areas that they lived in. So they would take them to another place where they were indeed strangers, perhaps didn't even speak the language in that place. So they weren't necessarily identifying with the people that they were fighting. Other reasons were to do with power, I suppose. This is a new power, and you'd rather be identifying with the powerful rather than with the powerless. Maybe the uniform, maybe pay, maybe coercion, maybe kind of an idea of the modern that these people represented now. They would have been complicated.
And the way that Africans understood colonialism is, there is one character in Afterlives that best embodies the paradox of colonialism. It's the German officer who is the representative of an army who killed Africans, slaughtered them, hung them in order to establish domination. And yet he thinks the European presence in Africa is nothing short of a noble mission. And he says, "We have come here to bring you this, mathematics and other clever things you would not have without us. This is our cunning plot, which only a child would misunderstand. We have come here to civilize you." When you were born, Zanzibar was still an English protectorate. Did you as a child believe in this narrative, that the English came to bring you clever things, such as mathematics?
No. That's because we had another story. And that other story that we had was that we were part of another network, another cosmopolitanism, if you like, which is the oceanic one. So we were already connected with another world, which is the Indian Ocean world. Part of it is the Muslim world, but also not all of it, so India and China and Arabia and so on. So we didn't believe it. I do remember that in a geography class when I was 13, which was the first time I was actually being taught by a European teacher. Primary school teachers that I had met until then were all local people. And it was a history class, and he had on the board, he had a map of, or drew a rough map of Africa, and said, so this is North Africa, and this is the Sahara, and this is Black Africa. So North Africa, the Mediterranean, these are civilized people. But because of the Sahara, it meant that civilization didn't get below that to Black Africa, where the uncivilized people are. And I thought, but that's where we live. What does he mean, uncivilized? We are civilized people. So no, it's not. So it was a surprise to hear this being said. And of course, nobody believed it, because we knew different.
But some people were maybe affectionate toward
Absolutely.
English.
That's a difference, a very complicated thing. It's a very complicated thing in the way that I've suggested. What was it that attracted people? And it's also different because it didn't mean that you lost, particularly people who thought of themselves as belonging to this Indian Ocean cosmopolitanism I'm thinking of, which is very much a coastal thing, the littoral, as it were. It didn't mean that by choosing to know more or even to admire the European culture, civilization, or power, it didn't mean that you saw yourself as lesser, because you're still connected with the other thing. A little bit like the way, say, Egypt responded to European modernity. It embraced it, the music changed, the way people dressed changed, but it doesn't mean that Egyptians despise themselves as a result. They still thought of themselves as civilized in a different way.
You mentioned the Indian Ocean, and your prose is not only about conflict and crisis and migration, is also about love. You write wonderful stories. It's about how families function, but also about movements across the Indian Ocean. You've been referred to as the Indian Ocean writer, and your literature is full of merchants, Arab merchants, Indian merchants who come across the Indian Ocean to Africa in their ships, along with the monsoon. And I felt like the monsoon is a very important, if not almost a character, in your books. Can you expand on this idea a little?
Sure. Our house was very, very near the docks, and you may have read this already in something that I've said in an interview or something, but from the window of our house I could see the ships coming in, so it was that close. My father's work was dealing with precisely with the merchandise that came on the monsoon. He too was a merchant. So I grew up with all these people from different parts of the Indian Ocean around us at certain times of the year. They're all over the place. I sometimes used to think that we didn't even need to go to the rest of the world. The world was coming to us. And you could see Indians, Somalis, various kinds of Arab people, Persians, etc. there, speaking the different languages with their different merchandises, their dresses, their arguments, and so on. It's unforgettable.
You wrote Afterlives immediately after you retired. You were a professor of literature at Kent University for 30 years?
35.
35 years. What's it like to be a full-time writer?
Oh, it was wonderful. Not immediately, because retirement didn't relieve me entirely of academic duties. You know, you've already agreed to do things, whatever. Mm-hmm. But within 6 months or so, I was a free man. It was pretty wonderful, yeah. And that's why I was able to write Afterlives much more quickly than any of the other books, because there was nothing else to do but write. And the other things that you do in life, shop and cook and whatever.
Did you ever think of writing a novel in Swahili?
No.
Why not?
Well, it's because I think there's a kind of intimacy that a writer has with language, which is not really about national obligation or something like that. I don't think I have that relationship with Swahili. I don't know if people who are not writers always understand this, that you can't always say, I'm going to write in this language or that language, even if you know that language, because you have to know a language in a different way to write in it. So I speak Swahili fluently, and I speak it whenever I'm with anybody who speaks Swahili. I read it and so on, but I don't have that sense of it when I'm writing, whereas I do with English. So that's how it happens. It's just a bit of a gift.
What do you think of the Swahili translations of your novels?
Oh, it's very good. There's only one so far. I think there's another one come. Yeah. I don't think the reading culture has established itself quite, really, in our Swahili-speaking world. People read books. Even this was also true of me when I was at school. People read books that they're told to read at school, partly because there isn't a reading culture for pleasure. People don't read for pleasure in the way that we're familiar with. Books are expensive, and there isn't this idea of, there is to some extent, but it's not like taken for granted that you'll hear about a book and you'll go to a bookshop and buy it, because you probably won't find it in a bookshop in the first place, or you'll be surprised at how much it costs by the time it gets to a place like Zanzibar or Dar es Salaam. But that's changing. So part of the reason that there haven't been many translations, or there aren't many translations, is precisely because there isn't that culture. But there are some...
That's really unfortunate, because this is what literature was invented for, to bring us pleasure.
Yeah, that's it. But then that's precisely what people will have to learn. At the moment, of course, they find pleasure in other ways. It's not that they don't know about finding pleasure, but it's not from reading. It will come. It will come because it's something that we learn, I think, about what we can get from reading. You could take, different cultures, mass reading idea, say in Britain, for example. Well, that didn't really happen till mid-late 19th century. the idea that people could read. And even then it was magazines and journals or whatever rather than books. So the idea of now you go on a train and almost every second person pulls out a book or reads from a tablet or something like that. So I think it's something that's both learned, and it's also a result of a certain kind of prosperity that says, I have enough to spare to be able to buy books. But it's not always possible.
So you're not a superstar in Zanzibar?
Oh no, they care. They care because of the Nobel Prize now. And even then, it's only within a certain kind of official, shall we say, milieu. But people do know, because there's TV and they see interviews on TV and they say, oh, here's Abdulrazak, you know. But it doesn't mean they read the books yet. But they will, I hope.
When you left Zanzibar, you probably thought you would never come back because you left illegally without papers, but you did.
I did, yeah.
When did you go back for the first time, and how was that experience for you?
Well, it was a very interesting experience. We went back because there was a change of leadership, not a change of government, a change of leadership. Mm-hmm. And the new leader and his team said, okay, amnesty, everybody can come back if they want, and so on. It doesn't mean that when they come back, they'll get whatever has been taken away from them, because that's one of the things I'm sure you're familiar with, because I know it happened here, that everything was taken away from people. So, which is one of the reasons why so many people left, because their livelihood was taken away. So when it was okay to go back, many people returned, or their children returned, but they had to return in a different way. So I went back too. That was 17 years after I left. So I went back with great trepidation and uncertainty, a kind of guilt, I suppose, because...
Guilt? Why guilt?
Yeah, because in fact, after I left, it was difficult enough before we left, but after I left, things became even more difficult. And for a long time, there were many, many hardships and shortages, and the terrors continued, etc., etc. And there I was in England making a life for myself. I know it wasn't easy, but, you know, making a life, getting on and so on. And so the guilt is to think, what will they think? Will they think that I've forgotten about them? Or will they say, as people often say in those situations, he's no longer one of us, he's become, you know, something else now out there. So those are my concerns, my anxieties, as it were. But in fact, it was uncalled for, because as soon as I got back, I was welcomed back, and it's been that way ever since. So that was 1984 when I first went back. And since then, I come and go as I please, as I wish, and regularly, yeah.
Leaving your birthplace, your country, is also a collective trauma that Romanians have been going through. I think 6 million of us live abroad, and of course they didn't leave for their lives. They left to make a life. Yet it is another form of survival.
Sure.
What does one loses and what does one gain when one leaves?
Sure. I mean, that's what also interested me. Thinking only of myself at that time, but what also interested me was not simply how am I going to cope here as a stranger, but what have I done? What have I lost? And as you mentioned, my first novel was called Memory of Departure. So it wasn't about living in England. It was about that process of leaving too. And I think that goes on. It doesn't go away. I mean, that continues, that sense of living in both places, and that sense of having lost something while having gained something. And the loss is not complete. It's not a complete tragedy, the loss, because I live in my imagination to a great extent in that other place. And of course you can go back now and then. But it remains a loss because you can't share in it fully, and because there are certain things that you cannot retrieve. They're gone. Maybe it's friendships, or maybe it's people that you don't see anymore, or they pass away and you're not there, or you maybe just participating in certain things. But then the other life is also full. So, you know, you live, in a way, I find it sort of quite a dynamic situation rather than as time goes by and you learn to live in it, to cope in it. I find it a dynamic situation because you have both things. You have ways of seeing that are not available to somebody who doesn't have the experience of that other place. So that's the plus.
To conclude with, where is home? Where you are born or wherever you choose to rebirth?
Well, it's an interesting question because we're now familiar with this idea of human movement as being, you know, kind of like a contemporary phenomenon. Millions of people are coming this way, going that way, and making a life. So I do think that we have to rethink the idea of when we say, where is home? The implication is that you only have one. I have two. And they're both home.
Because you write on such important topics such as migration, crisis, colonialism, critics often concentrate on the raising awareness purpose of your writing. Nevertheless, you are a very gifted, wonderful storyteller.
Thank you.
What do you believe the primary role of a writer is? To raise awareness, to write a good story? Which one?
I think of myself as, I'll answer that question as a reader first. So when I read a book, when I take a book up, it will probably be because I think it sounds an interesting topic, idea, or whatever. But if after a few pages it's not giving me pleasure, I will put it to one side. I won't read anymore. So I will answer the question by saying that I think the primary thing about reading, and about writing probably, although for the writer it's not necessarily pleasurable to write. Sometimes it's quite difficult and painful and, you know, repetitive, and you have to get the thing right. But the point of the product is to give pleasure. But not only to give pleasure in the way that it might make a person smile or laugh or whatever, but to give pleasure in a more profound way, because it's well made. So it's like listening to a piece of music, and you don't say, what do I like? It works. And something about it, the arrangement, the words, what it invokes in you. But it isn't only that, it goes beyond that, because very often when we read, we learn something. So we learn something, it might be something we already know, and we learn to see a different perspective on it, or a different angle on it. And that's beautiful in its own way, to think, oh, I didn't think of it like that. But sometimes we learn about things we don't know at all. And that too is rather beautiful. The reason it's beautiful because it makes us understand that other people are like us, or we are like other people. I'll tell a story, finally, of when Goethe, the German poet, was interested in the idea, which he kind of more or less invented, Literatură. And he was reading Persian poetry, and he was reading this, and he was reading that. As you know, he did that thing with the very famous Persian poet. He also read a Chinese novel. And he wrote to one of his correspondents to say, they're just like us. Now, you might think that that's a racist position. Why would you have thought in the first place that they're not?
They were different.
But on the other hand, that is what we do think, even if you don't put it as bluntly as Goethe did, by saying they're just like us. But we do think, so this is just like how I feel. And so there is a sense of kind of sharing our humanity with others when we read, finally.
Thank you. It has been a pleasure listening to you, and even a greater pleasure to have read your books.
Thank you very much. You're very kind. Thank you.